Okay. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, we thank you that you are here with us. You are inside each of us. You are present with us, and you are present across the whole globe. And so we're reminded of that as we connect together via Zoom, that we are part of your world together, that you have created. We want to live in it the way you've modeled it to be lived in. So I pray, Lord, that this time together will be a chance to not only connect, but connect on what works and how we see you revealed in our lives and in our ministries. So we just put all of that into this 2 hours. I thank you for the commitment that this group has made to learning about health, because when we're healthy, you grow us. And so we want this sixth session to fill that out. We want to hear you as we're presenting, but also as we're talking in our groups and all the feedback. So, Father, we just again thank you that we can be co-workers with you in this work in your church. Amen. So here we are at session 6. We have talked about the growth principles. We've talked about processes and how to use the growth cycle, primarily in the church cycle, but also personally. All of these principles are applicable as individuals and as organizations and or as churches and or businesses and or as or families or small groups or leadership teams. We've talked a lot about conducting the church survey. 4 people have filled out the survey, the SurveyMonkey questionnaire. So if you would do that, I'd appreciate it. But so far, the 4 people who have replied, 100% say they feel pretty comfortable about conducting a survey in a church or their church. So that's good. We've talked about debriefing the survey profile and the understand phase of where we discern the barriers to all by itself growth being released. And we last session we talked about the 3 colors quite a bit, and especially we talked about the wholeness test and the empowerment test. And today we're going further around the cycle into action planning and experiencing. If you've named the barriers well, then you can put an action plan and you can execute the plan and then experience. In theory, if you've executed the plan, you should have removed barriers and God's all by itself growth potential should be releasing. So yeah, action planning and experiencing growth. And so we're going to talk a lot about that. So our check-in today, we're going to break you up into little groups like we typically do. We're going to let you decide who's going to present on your behalf rather than choosing someone by alphabetical order or anything like that, or birthday order. So what about the 3-color discipleship tools are you most wanting to explore further? So that's sort of a pickup from last week. What struck you? You could be talking about the Trinitarian Compass or the Wholeness Test or the Empowerment Test or the other tests. I hope you've used your tokens to do other tests or given them away. Shane, how long are we going out for? 6 or 7 minutes, I think. Group number 1, who's speaking on behalf of Allison, Doug, Steve, and Steve?
I can. So we talked a little bit about the wholeness test, and then Steve told us his experience of empowering one, and so we're noting that the wholeness test is in process, and there's things changing to it. You know, when I took it, the clouds were differently named, and it was interesting to see that that's developing. But I was interested more in the empowering one. I think for some people I'm working with and myself, that it could be interesting. So it was good to hear a bit more on the empowering leadership test.
Okay. And group 2, Darren, Jane, Ruben, and Sue. Who's speaking on behalf of you guys? Or did you point somebody?
No, we didn't. We were reflecting on when in the cycle and the repetition of doing the survey might good points be to actually consider using some of the tests as well. That was our major question, really. We'd got all these tests, but we really didn't know what to do with them.
Yeah.
And were there good times to use them?
A quick response to that question. Thank you for asking it. In the old days, when we were we would sort of do the church survey, and then we'd do name the barriers. And then we'd put into the action plan, let's do some of the 3-color tests. And increasingly, we're starting to think, wouldn't it be better to do those tests when we're gathering data? Let's gather data. So you might not know what your minimum factor is, so you might want to leave that till a little later, but you might do the wholeness test and the empowerment test, say, and maybe even the community test right up front at the same time. And maybe not all the same people. Like maybe you've got 40 or 50 people doing the church survey. You might not have that same 40 or 50 do the 3-color test, but you might get maybe the leadership team or all the small group leaders to do a few of the tests and just augment. And when we get to the review of that part of the cycle, I'll answer that a little bit more fully too. Thank you. And group 3, Moses, Joe, Matthew. Who's speaking on your behalf? Matthew.
I am, yeah. We talked a bit about the 3-color compass and how we're not always sure why we end up with certain colors for certain tests. I know I've taken most of the tests and I have all 3 colors at some point, just not all at the same time. And different mix. I think each result for me has been a little bit different in terms of colors. We also just talked about it's exciting to have a framework in these tests to give us some direction to grow and be more like Jesus.
Cool. Couldn't say it better. Thank you. Okay. So let's keep going. We're going to do a bit of review today, of course, although we are going on to new things. So session 6, we've gone through the perceive, test, and understand phase. And so now we're going past that into the planning cycle. So, but each of the phases of the cycle, I hope we've reinforced that enough. They're all interdependent. What you do in one will impact later on further around in the cycle. So, and definitely in the barriers, you want to make sure that you've got the barrier well named before you jump to planning. But Shane's going to talk about that some more. Some sort of basic planning tools. I mean, you can bring other planning tools to this part of the cycle. It doesn't have to be NCD planning tools by any stretch of the imagination. And this idea of doing and perceiving, are we doing stuff that's based on what we perceived or what we found out in the data? If our perceptions weren't that accurate, we want to talk about that today. And this idea that we've got to keep communicating throughout the cycle, not just sort of once a year when we do the church survey, but ongoing all the time, about where we are in the process, but also what we're finding. And some of the things we hope to achieve is focus on ownership by the community of their results and where they are and who they are and what they're up to, and then interpreting outcomes and learning posture. So a sense of, yeah, we're growing here. So yeah, today is about perceive, test, and understand. Or no, I mean, today isn't, that we've already done that. We also want to remember that these principles exist whether we want to address them or not. I was talking with one church and they sort of didn't want to work on health, and I thought, why wouldn't you? I mean, it's so fundamental to who we are, but I think they see it sort of programmatically, and NCD is a program, or even working on health is a thing we do, and we would argue no, it's that essence of who you are. It's not about what you're doing, although you may have to do some stuff to become. We're gardeners, we're not mechanics. The farmer gets up in the morning and the farmer has stuff to do. The gardener has a role, and the garden needs a gardener. God does the growing, but he doesn't do the gardening. That's our job, and we can't do God's job. We can't make something grow. But it's the cycle is continuous. It's not linear. The seed goes into the ground, it sprouts, it grows something, it produces more seeds. Those seeds go back into the ground. And then we have more plants. And this whole idea that the fruit of an apple might be another apple, the fruit of an apple seed might be one more apple, but maybe it's actually another apple tree. Or if you really sort of think deeply, maybe it's an apple orchard. And so this idea that multiplication is going on, and it's God that does the multiplying. It's the same with the loaves and fishes. The little boy brings the loaves and fishes and Jesus multiplies them. That multiplication activity is one of the growth principles that's behind all of this. and not everything can be accomplished in a single cycle. This is meant to be an ongoing process, year after year after year, till Jesus comes back. If people will say, well, when can we stop doing NCD? When we get super healthy, can we stop? No, you want to stay super healthy. And again, this idea that growth is guided. It's not linear. It's not mechanical. It's not open the box and follow the instructions. It's kind of messy, dirty. Sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 1 back. Some days it feels like it's 3 steps backwards. That's how growth seems to happen in life. So we talked about the perceived phase. Where are we? What often happens at the perceived phase is we've sort of guessed, or we've not guessed, but have an idea of what's going on, and we'll jump straight to do. And so the coach's role, or the champion's role, or the leadership team's role, or the health team's role is, hang on, we can't just jump to do. We've got to understand whether our perceptions are accurate or not. So don't jump to gardening. The test phase, that is where we gather data. And to Ruben's question, this might be a great time to add data from other tests. Maybe the whole leadership team did the empowerment test and found out that they were relatively green as a leadership team, but the church is relatively red. What does that say? I don't know. Or we may find the church, we're now on cycle 4, and we're finding that we're shifting a bit towards blue, and the leadership team is quite blue. Are they dragging us there? And so on and so on. So you can do lots more gathering in the test phase than just the church survey. And it's about hearing people. I mean, the survey isn't just to gather data, it's to pull the stories out of, and the narrative of who we are out. And if we think of the survey as a conversation starter, or any of the 3 color tests as a conversation starter, where could we start poking and wondering and exploring? I think that we can see the tools a little more usefully. The understand phase, critical phase. Now, I tend to be green-red. And to Matthew's question about, why am I green-red in this survey, but I tend to be blue in this question, I find I'm typically sort of green-red on most of the tests. But yeah, it's all over the map. And then it varies. Some of the tests I've done multiple times, it changes. That's okay. I think some tests are more likely to change from one experience to another, because they might be a bit more role focused than another. Like the gift test, I think even the communal test might be a little more standard across the multiple times you do it, whereas the empowerment test might change a lot given on what position you're in or ministry role you have. So the understand phase is all about recognizing strengths and celebrating, but also recognizing barriers, discerning with God and one another what's holding us back from that all by itself growth being released. All those round wheels that we already have them, what's holding us back from stopping the car long enough to take the square wheels off and get the round wheels on? Some of the tools you might use during the understand phase is the debrief meeting, the story guide meeting. Shane talked about the 5 whys last time, and we did a little bit of a role play, or not last time, but when we did the understand. Change talk, which is the 3 color personal tool, or used in small groups. It's applying the cycle in a 3 color test. And then the key goal here is identifying true barriers that can be removed to help go where we have been called. And so this idea of God's inviting us to become, calling us forward, whether that's as individuals, as groups, as teams, as congregations, even full denominations. What are we being invited into with him, and how are we being shaped for mission and ministry and moving forward into more growth and multiplication? What are the barriers? And so it can sound a little negative, the understand phase. I like to think of it more as invitation than, barrier identification almost sounds like, oh, what are we doing wrong? And it's more sort of, no, how's God revealing himself so that we can step into more relationship and become more like Jesus? So fruitful action planning. I think this is where you're going to start taking over, isn't it? So I'll stop sharing so that Shane can take over.
Okay. Okay, that should be looking good for everybody.
Yep.
And as I go through here, if there's anything that I am reflecting about that you don't understand, or if you have a question about, feel free to interrupt me as we go along. Just jump in and speak up. I'm gonna talk a lot about planning and a little bit about do. Um, and the church seems to be good at doing things, so that's why the emphasis is more on planning than doing. Um, but the really important thing here is that you are not ready to plan. You're not going to be as confident that anything that we're doing or anything that we're planning is actually connected to the barriers we've identified, unless we've actually identified those barriers well. So it's only when you've got a really clear picture of what the barriers are that you're really ready to move into planning. If you find that you're struggling with planning, it might be because you don't have a clear barrier that's actionable identified yet. So it's better to spend a little more time, I think, in the understand phase. Make sure you've got a clear actionable barrier, and then the planning stuff will come into place a little more naturally. And so this business about barriers that Bill was talking about, there's a few ways that we can look at this. One way is to look at the picture in the distance, what's on the horizon, and what stands between where we are now and where we're called to go. That might be something that's actually in the way, but it could also be something that we're simply missing that we need to add. I'm going to be using the language of kind of a road trip for some of this conversation through the planning stage. So, what's the obstacle that's in our way, or what do we need in order to begin, the next part of our journey? Or maybe there's something that needs to change in the environment around us. So there's a few different ways that you can kind of look at barriers. You don't have to use the barrier language. And besides the environment around us, there might be some things, within us, within the church, or within people who are in the church, that require a little bit of work. And that's where the 3-color test can be helpful, alongside the church survey, to help identify some of those things and to help identify those barriers that may be a little more internal. So action planning. Here we are in this part of the cycle. And, as I said, if you've got a really clear actionable barrier, then the actions that you want to apply are going to be fairly clear. It won't be nebulous. The barrier is not that your minimum factor is holistic small groups. That's going to tell you roughly where the barrier is, but as we talked about in the 5 why example, we need to dig a little bit deeper to get to actually what that actionable thing is. But once we have that actionable thing, then it's much easier to try and plan it. So a few things that I'd like to, well, actually more than a few things, a handful of things that I'd like to introduce as kind of principles to the planning work that we do. It's really important to make sure that the actions that we're trying to plan are actually linked to the barriers. There's lots of things that a church can be doing. There's lots of fruitful things that a church can be doing. But if the actions that you're selecting to work on are not actually linked to the barriers that you've identified, then you may not be actually influencing the things that you're aiming to influence. You might be doing some good things, and you might be seeing growth, but they just might not be linked to the thing that's going to actually be most helpful. So make sure that the actions, you can actually draw the connection back to the barriers you've identified, or the things that you need to add, if you want to use that language. So small actions, think clarity, and think ownership. Okay. It's like it's like guiding the rudder on a large ship. Small course correction over many miles makes a big difference in your destination. So we don't want to think about spinning the wheel in the wheelhouse too far one direction or the other. Small things are absolutely the way to tackle this. Incremental, small adjustments. And learn as we go. Don't be discouraged if the action plan doesn't seem to be kind of going exactly as planned. Just like we want to approach the understand phase with curiosity, we want to approach the planning and doing phase and the subsequent phases in the cycle with a learning mindset. We can always adjust as we go along, but let's make sure we're learning. And the planning that we're talking about doesn't all have to be owned by the health team. There may be some things at the organizational level in the church that the health team will be involved with, or other boards or leadership teams will be involved with. But many teams and indeed individuals can be invited to participate in some way in how we're responding to what we see in the church survey results. So you might need to provide some coaching to small teams or individuals about the kinds of things I might want to think about, but this is not all on the shoulders of just one particular team in a church. We're going to talk a little bit more about pruning. Don't forget to prune. Pruning even, so I'll say no more about that at the moment. So keep it simple, keep communicating, have outcomes think about outcomes that you can actually measure. So it's a little bit challenging sometimes if we've got a goal that we can't actually figure out whether it was achieved or not. So we'll want to think about how we're going to figure out whether the actions we're planning actually got accomplished. And then also think about, what do we expect to experience? What's on the horizon? What did we imagine that place on the horizon look like? So let's just hold those things together. So a few things about the key focus here. We want to define the approach to removing the barriers we identified. So if we have a clear picture of the barrier, then all we're trying to do in the planning stage is figure out, how are we going to remove that? It's kind of like an engineering problem at this point. We know what the issue is. We know what we're missing, or we know what we need to get out of the way. Now, all we got to do is figure out how to make that happen. And part of that's describing the picture of
Good question, Shane.
Yeah, go ahead, Doug.
Could you give us a couple examples of barriers that you've seen churches overcome? Like, I'm particularly interested in like the effective infrastructure. What would be an example of a barrier that if you got rid of it, growth would happen?
Particularly around effective structures, you're asking for?
Yeah, that'd be one of them. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I've met with many churches who just don't set goals. They don't have a process that they regularly move through, where they're thinking about where they are now and where they want to go, and collecting feedback and input about how we're going to get there. So on effective structures, I mean, one of the things might just be identifying that we don't have a process where we're actually thinking about where we want to go or how we want to get there. It's like a big kind of high level example of a barrier, something that might be missing. Right? Is that helpful? I can't read your lips, Doug.
Yeah, I think of barriers mainly in the negative, but it sounds like a number of them are things that are not happening, that if you put a positive thing in place, then you're going to get to growth.
Yeah, I mean, you could think of, what do we need to add? If we want to go on a road trip, what do we need to get there? Are we missing our passports? Are we missing our visa? Is our suitcase too old? Right. So in the church, have we equipped people with the right sort of training to be able to lead the way we want them to lead? Do we have the sort of structure set up to meet and hold people accountable? Are we in an outmoded way of thinking about leadership top down as opposed to, empowering people? Those are all sorts of things we can think about that are kind of a positive mindset, perhaps. Yeah.
Okay.
So part of this is describing a picture about where we want to go. So we kind of have an idea what we want to add or what we want to get out of the way to start the journey. What do we think it's going to look like when we get there as part of this as well? So, consider how is the future picture, how do we imagine that's going to be different from where we are right now? Cast the vision. This is what I like to call the destination brochure. Paint the picture of what it's like, this place that we're all trying to get to, and that can generate some excitement. And that might be thinking about what builds on the beautiful thing we've already got. It might be about what do we need to leave behind. When we go on a journey, we can't take everything with us. We can't take the whole kitchen. There might be some things we want to bring with us. So the outcome of the planning stage, the primary outcome of the planning stage that we want to be aiming for is a plan that's actionable, that addresses the barriers. So it should describe where we're going, the basic stuff about project management and planning. What will get done specifically, by whom, and when do we think it's going to happen? And what do we already have? And what do we need to make the journey, right? I really like the road trip metaphor for the planning stuff. I want to just emphasize strengths because, as Doug, you were kind of reflecting, some of this can feel a little bit negative. But it doesn't have to be. And in fact, it's really not. But let's make sure that when we're thinking about where we want to go and how we're going to get there and kind of what barriers are, let's pay attention to our strengths. These are the things where the church is likely most effectively feeling like they're partnered with God already. They're things that are going to naturally contribute to growth and sustainment of health, almost without putting a lot of effort into it, because it's the stuff that we're good at already and love to do. So you might readily kind of see evidence of how God is moving in the areas where you feel strong, because you know those areas and you recognize God moving in those areas. So pay attention to them. A small amount of input and attention to those things will keep them trucking along. But use them, like look at your strong areas and figure out how can we use what we're really good at, what feels really natural to us. We're obviously seeing God at work, and how can we draw some of that into the areas that feel a little less natural. This is all about using our energy wisely, because we've got limitations on our resources, and this is why connecting the actions to the barriers is so important. We want to make sure that we're putting the effort of the planning and doing into the things that are going to have the most benefit, and that's going to be stuff that's connected to the barriers that are most important to us. So you might be asking questions about, well, what about these actions? Like, what are the actions that we can be thinking about? Like, what are small things that we can be doing? There's a whole database of ideas that you'll see in the hyperlink at the back of the NRGs, or the advanced reports from the church survey. So the hyperlink here is at the bottom. Anybody can get to this hyperlink. You don't need a login or anything like that to get there. And there's examples of small actions for every single question on the survey, every single quality characteristic, every theme. There's rafts of ideas. And if you're kind of stuck for some things that might be good actions to work on the barriers that you've got, you can kind of look at this information. When we do a debrief, we will provide you a handful of examples, but there's a whole database that you can go look around at. And these are all very small, doable, manageable kinds of actions. They might not be exactly what you want to do in your context, but they're going to give you some good ideas. You can take some of these, tweak them, or use them to generate other things that might be good as cycle starters or small actions in your setting. So if you're stuck, you can always reach out to us or go to this database. Bill.
Just a quick point. Sometimes the minimum factor is really confusing to people. That is why it's their minimum factor. So like when you walk into a church that has loving relationships as its maximum factor, they totally get how to connect with one another. You walk into a church where loving relationships is the minimum factor, and they sort of don't even know what you're talking about. Or you walk into a church where passionate spirituality is the maximum factor, and they totally understand what connecting with God is. You walk into an Anglican church, typically passionate spirituality is the minimum factor, and the connecting with God, encountering God, the living Christ, etc., that may be really foreign to them. And so sometimes these hints can be ways of unblocking that sort of, I don't even know what you're talking about kind of tone. And so, yeah, they're not prescriptive, but they might be, as Shane says, they might be really helpful for helping people to understand kind of what's this thing we don't even get. Anyway.
Yeah, I think they get across the idea that, you know, none of this has to be complicated. For example, if you've got you know, one that I see often is that you know, loving relationships might be a low characteristic, and so one of the cycle starter suggestions around that is just, you know, you get together at your regular board meeting, you know, take 10 minutes out of that meeting and just spend some time checking in with one another for no other purpose except to, you know, be aware of what's happening in people's lives, you know, what they care about, what they're concerned about, what's happening with them, right? This small step that gradually over time can help, you know, build relationship more than just sitting down and rolling up our sleeves right away and getting down to the agenda. So, when we're thinking about how many or what sorts of things we might want to be putting in a plan in response to the church survey and barriers that we've identified, we want to think about what the capacity of the church is. The reports provide a perspective on capacity, and it's really a function of, you know, overall health, so the average result, and balance. So if you have a really healthy church with strong results and they're really well balanced, then that's a church that's going to have high capacity. If balance is a little bit off, or if health is a little bit low, then capacity is going to be lower. But the whole point that we want to get across here is that don't overburden. You know, think about what the capacity of the church is. Think about what the capacity of the people are. It's better to start small, you know, do one thing if you got a church with really low capacity, or maybe just kind of move through the cycle and just start some conversations and know that you have the chance to go through the cycle again next year. And it's better to be on the journey slowly than to be overwhelmed by it and have people wanting to take the off ramp. And pruning, we're going to provide some tools next that can be helpful for pruning, but pruning is not just about getting rid of the dead stuff. It's not just about taking the square wheels off your wagon. It's not just about stopping the thing that is an energy drain, although it can be all those things. But even the branches that are fruitful, we want to prune so that they can become more fruitful. So we want to be paying attention to where we can do a little bit of pruning in all areas, even where we're fruitful. So let's not forget to do that in the mix of things. It's easy to add actions that are adding activity, but it's okay to have an action that is about removing something or discerning how we can make something more efficient, or, you know, doing a little bit of pruning in a healthy area. So don't be afraid to put those kinds of things in your action plans as well. So a simple tool is something called an impact effort map. If you've got a bunch of ideas that, you know, you're thinking about implementing as a response to the church survey, or you've got a whole raft of existing ministries and activities you've got going on, you'd like to figure out what to keep and what to prune, then this can work in both contexts. So it can work for existing or new stuff. But the whole idea here is we just have a grid that maps out impact and effort. And so I'll just put all these 4 things up on the screen here. So on the left axis, on the axis here, we've got the amount of effort that we require is on the bottom axis here, and the amount of impact is on the vertical axis. So where we have a high impact and high effort activity, that's what we call a significant initiative. That's something that you might want to plan. Maybe you're not going to be able to get into it right away, but it might be worth doing, but you have to think about the resources that you're going to need in order to make that happen. If you map something out and say, well, this is a high impact activity, but it's low effort on the horizontal axis, then by all means, like, just do it. Like, if it's a high impact and it doesn't take much effort, then, go for that stuff. The nice to do stuff that is kind of low effort, low impact, maybe you want to think about doing it when you can, or if you have the energy at some point in time, but maybe you want to put it on simmer for the moment. And this stuff over here in this kind of lower right quadrant, that's high effort and low impact, these are the things you want to particularly think about pruning or changing so that they're not drains anymore. So if you have a bunch of stuff, just going through the exercise of mapping it out and getting people's perspectives on, well, what do you think is high impact or high effort, and mapping this stuff out literally on a big sheet of chart paper can generate a lot of good conversation around, how impactful and how much effort are some of these activities and ministries that are involved with, and it can help a group come to a realization about things that need to be pruned or things that we should get on top of and do right away. So the action plan is about identifying, what's the current picture? What do we need to get out of the way, or what do we need to add to get to where we want to go? So we need to have a picture of what the future is. What is it that the actions are expected to result in? Where are we trying to go? So this is what I like to call the destination brochure. Here's the picture, folks, of where we're aiming ourselves. This is what we think life is like in another year or 2 years. Describe to people where it is that we're trying to get. And then the plan is a lot about the roadmap for how we're going to get there. Here's where we are now. Here's where we're going to go. Here's what we're imagining is going to happen on the journey. There might be some hazardous things. There might be some bridges that we need to go over. There might be some places where we need to stop for a rest and have a coffee. The action plan is really about identifying how we're going to get to that destination. So just kind of as an example, things that we can think about with an action plan. If we have an example where, let's say small group participation is low, but there's interest in deeper community in a church. And we've also got a situation where maybe leaders feel kind of unprepared to go deeper with small groups. So the church wants to go deeper. Leaders feel a little bit unprepared about how to do that. And, we're a little bit concerned about small group participation. These are just some example actions, hypothetical things that is what an action plan really looks like. So just as an example, I'll walk through the top line. The action is we're going to host a small group leaders training. Our pastor's going to lead that because he's got some experience with it. We're going to have a particular date when we think that's going to get done. And we're going to identify what we need to get there. We got to figure out what the content's going to be. We got to get invitations out. And here's how we're going to leverage the stuff that's strong, right? This is the good stuff to incorporate into the plan. What do we got working for us that we can use to our advantage? We got a lot of hope and we're really welcoming. So those are good things that we can incorporate into a training. And how are we going to measure whether this action was successful, right? So as an example, we could say, well, if we get at least 6 of our people coming to this and they walk away expressing more confidence, then that's more fruitfulness. That's a measure of a win there. So this is an example of kind of the key elements that you want to be thinking about in your action plan. Write it down in a grid, kind of like this, or whatever your familiar tool might be. Let's talk a bit about pitfalls. So here's a few things that can be a bit of a pitfall for people. We're busy, but are we aligned with kind of where God's calling us to go? We might be busy doing things, but are the things that we're doing aligned with the mission that we think we're being called into? So check in on that. We want to make sure that the actions that we've got are actually working on the barriers we've identified, so that we don't spend energy in the wrong place, or that we're not missing the barriers, that we're not avoiding barriers that are really important to address. And also, it's taking on too much. Don't take on too much. You might have a whole list of things that you'd like to do, but save some for next year. And just part of fundamental planning is making sure that we know who's responsible. It's great to have an awesome plan, but if everybody's pointing the finger about who's actually responsible to make it happen, or to make a particular action happen, then it's probably not going to happen in the way we hope it to. So it's important to just maintain focus on the plan, check in on it periodically so that we don't drift. And don't be afraid to adjust it, right? It's not set in concrete. It's not unchangeable. So link actions to barriers, stay focused, look at your strengths, use them, and make sure we're doing a little bit of pruning. And then anticipate what that destination looks like. That's kind of what the destination brochure image I like to use is all about. Paint the picture for people so we know where we're going. So Bill's going to put us in your breakout groups again. And here's what we are inviting you to think about. Either one or both of these things. Think about an action that you're considering in your context. This might be in your church. This might be in a church you're coaching. It might be a personal thing. But if you're thinking about an action, what barrier does it address? So think about how an action that you're considering connects to a barrier that you're trying to work on. And what would success look like in that situation? And or can you think of something in your context, an action, and where it might fit on that impact effort grid that I showed you, right? Is it a quick win? Is it a significant thing? Is it maybe just a nice to do? Or is it a resource drain that you'd actually be better to get rid of? So you can look at both those questions, or kind of pick one of those ones that you want to focus on for this breakout. I think we'll have the same amount of time as last time.
It looks like Moses has a question.
Yeah, quick question.
Yeah.
Pastor Shane, about the planning session, and also especially for apply some plan into action. One of the church I pastors before, we have a big problem. We can call in NCT-based language like barrier. It's coming from the founder of the church. So elders, family, manipulating church decision. They are one who rule out all the church members and everything. So people has been known for this one is a strong barrier, but there is a low capacity to carry on in plan or also action, because they are all the key leaders. These families are key leaders to control all the church decision. So they are hard to initiate any changes, and really, really impossible to remove the barriers. So even though we know the NCD or some healthy cycle of the growing, but some leaders, like manipulating leadership, already sit on the long time as a founder or key person. It is very hard to starting out and breaking out that the barrier, because barrier is very concrete. So I was assigned newly, so I didn't know any. That's why without any knowledge in the past history, I started to business meeting and then do some survey around. now the kind of the conclusion is this: we I'm so sorry to tell you this one. We disfellowship this family out of the church, and then that was the solution. But we have a lot of bleeding. But after that things happened, 2 years after, church has been 4 times growing, physically and spiritually. So I don't know. You mentioned about the plan need capacity base or some availability capacity to carry on the plan. But some case, the capacity was very low, but strong leadership like the pastor or some leaders driving this one to remove out the a barrier, then may work. I don't know. That case, there can be a case for your sharing this planning session or not. I just want to share before we discuss.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, and I'd be happy to talk with you offline a bit more in detail about that situation you've been dealing with, and how we might learn from it, or if you're looking for some other advice about that. But yeah, every situation is going to be unique, and some can be complex. I would still always come at it from the same approach that if we can keep things simple and think about incremental, even if we've got really complex situations, then eventually we'll see some of that growth that you're talking about. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Good.
Okay,
we'll send you out to your rooms now then.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. So, group one: Allison, Doug, Steve, and Steve. Where did you take things in your breakout?
Allison had a good example of trying to merge a vestry. So, Allison, are you up for maybe sharing that example as a barrier to overcome?
Yeah, sure. So I look after 2 churches, and in terms of effective structures, I'm looking at merging the 2 vestries, the 2 governing bodies, so that I'm taking away the pressure of finding people to fill those roles and releasing those people to do other things. It's kind of thinking about, is that counterproductive if we're looking at a hopefully growing church and new people coming in to take on roles? But for now, it feels like a barrier that effective structures, just finding people to fulfill roles is preventing us doing some of the real work, not real work, but some of the work of God in a more practical way.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good example of healthy pruning. For sure. That's going to be more fruitful. Okay, awesome. How about group 2? Darren, Jane, Ruben, and Sue. Where did you take things?
We got a little bit off track, but we would partly, I think there's a sense that there is a generational issue in how people respond to the very concept of kind of planning these things. So we were particularly talking about younger people who simply don't respond well generally to we'll work out a plan and we'll work towards it. They want to work together to see how God is working things out and see where we end up. And in the context of NCD, that in itself seems to be a bit of a barrier, because we're kind of going against the very way that it's set up to work. And we were wondering how you kind of deal with that, because that's a reality of kind of teenagers, 20-somethings. That is how they think and function.
Yeah. So just a couple quick comments I have about that, maybe Bill wants to add to it, is you don't have to use language that feels foreign to people or that feels uncomfortable. So I like to use the road trip metaphor. Lots of people like to travel. I know lots of young people who like to travel too. So, I mean, that can feel very freeing, but you're not going to get into the country that you need to get into if you don't have certain things in place, like your passport or the visa, for example. So I think that kind of road trip metaphor, the travel metaphor, is a good one to invite people into, because that doesn't feel like project management. It feels like some things that people can be familiar with. So what, in your context, are kind of the metaphors that people can relate to, that they can fit into, that feel like they're freeing more than they are constraining. The other thing I'm thinking about is, who are the kind of red green people and who are the blue people? And it might be a little hazardous to put like a blue person in charge of like the plan. So if you kind of know a little bit about styles of people,
Did it?
and then you can kind of put people in the seats where they're going to feel most comfortable. So absolutely, we want blue people to be involved in the planning, right? But we want them to be involved in a way that's going to feel comfortable and natural to them.
I would just add a little bit. Two things. One, I was, even when we were looking at the slides and Shane was putting them up, I thought, I hope you don't all feel like you have to have this complex grid system for a plan. I mean, this is what's behind a plan, and you can use as much or as little of that complexity when you're planning with a church, for sure. But the principles, as Shane was unfolding them, they still should be in the background. And I don't want to disclose too much about Shane's family in front of everybody, but he's got a son and daughter that are in the Southeast Asia right now. One of his two kids is more a planner than the other one. And I remember Shane telling me a little bit about them as they were preparing to go on the trip. One was much more the planner, and the other one was, well, we'll sort of figure it out when we get there. And they're both in their 20s. So I was thinking of them, Sue, when you were bringing this up. But I hear you. And as Shane says, this really does need to fit who the community is. And if it's a lower capacity church, then we don't have to be too complex. We don't have to make it. We don't have to make it feel unnatural, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And those, like, just my children as an example, they're going to have a better trip because they have different personalities, right? If I had two versions of my son or two versions of my daughter going on the trip, they might not have as good a journey. But because they're together and they're sort of balancing one another out a little bit, then I think they're going to have a better experience because of that. Room 3, Joe and Matthew, where did you take things?
We talked about how in our different contexts, one of the most important things is leaders understanding the spirit of the church, culture of the church. There was a specific wording that I don't remember, but basically that. And also a struggle with many churches being that people come and they want things to be the way that they've always been, but then they go away and come back on Sunday and don't want to be involved. And the action that we suggested for that, we spent a lot more time talking about the spirit of the church than concrete actions, but we did get to that. And we suggested a deliberate, regular community event. I said weekly or monthly, depending on church's resources and capacity and everything, such as a lunch after a service where people are already there, to help the leaders actually get to know the community they're in, and also to help the people in the church build relationships with each other and with their leaders so that they're more likely to want to actually get involved in something. So the barriers would be apathy or lack of knowledge, and success would be better communication.
Yeah, and that's good. I like that reflection that your group had. This is where kind of the story guide meeting can be helpful in understanding people's stories to add it to the church survey data, or gathering together and understanding people at gatherings like you were just talking about there. The barrier to people engaging could be, if we ask enough why questions, that we just don't understand what it is that will engage them, right? Why is it that people don't want to show up to the stuff that I'm planning? Oh, well, guess what? Not everybody's interested in the stuff that Shane thinks is cool. So let's find out, what people really think is cool. Maybe you got a group of guys in the church who love old cars, and if you're trying to work on small group ministry, how could you build a small group ministry around, the car stuff that they love? Like what really is going to get people excited and, you know, work the plan, work your stuff around that, as opposed to trying to change the personality of everybody that you've got. So, excellent, thanks. So we're gonna keep trucking along here. We spent a lot of time on planning, and you know, we've been saying that the natural tendency of the church is to do. The thing to be careful about is that we just don't leap into doing before we really understand what it is. And perhaps that's reflected here, because we only have a couple slides to talk about in the do phase. And I think once we get to the point where we're ready to do, we're probably going to just go ahead and do that pretty well. I haven't experienced a lot of problems in churches where there's actually a plan, and then the doing just kind of completely falls off the rails. But there are some things to pay attention to here. So let's just unlock all the pitfalls, Bill. And
oh, sorry.
Yes. So let's keep people engaged, as we were talking about a few minutes ago, in the stuff that they find engaging, right? So getting blue people to work on the blue stuff, and getting green and red people to work on the stuff that really excites them. Keep them engaged through the process, you know, understand where people are at, so that they, you know, they stay engaged, that we don't get bored. And we also recognize that it's not only in the doing. There will definitely be people who are coming at it from the perspective that, you know, we just need to do something, please. Like, let's just do it. Nothing else really matters. But making sure that we're really connected to the barriers in the way that we're doing is going to be so important. And let's not mistake busyness for godliness, as we said earlier. Let's not mistake being busy for being fruitful. In the action plan, we were trying to identify, how are we going to know if this action was actually successful? The action is not successful because we ticked it off in the box and said that action is complete. Did the action result in an outcome that is driving a little more fruitfulness or a little more health? And yeah, this let's figure it out when we get there kind of question. We were just talking about this, right? That's fine. There are some things that we're going to have to figure out when we get there. And there may be people in your midst who are going to be helpful, because there are some gray areas. The destination that you actually get at is not going to look exactly like the picture that you painted in the metaphorical brochure about where we're trying to go. And those people who really love to live into that haziness can be helpful in bringing some hope into those sorts of situations. So when we think about, you know, the main things that we want to get out of the do phase and doing it right, you know, stick with it. You've made a plan. Now just stick with the plan and execute it. Or decide together to change it if that's an obvious thing that needs to happen. So a lot of this is just about discipline. Who are the project managers in your church? Who's the project manager in your midst that can help the group stay on track? Identifying that person and leaning into those sorts of people will be useful.
Okay, thanks, Shane. Just quickly, I have run into a couple of churches where, you know, they were really good at naming their barrier. They were really good at putting in a plan, but they couldn't stick to the plan. They were planners more than they were doers. Interestingly, most people want to do. But this church was kind of, we don't like doing, we like planning and thinking and preparing. They were kind of a green church, green red. They would much rather do vision casting and where are we going to go and all that sort of directional stuff, but not actually deliver on it when the time came. So every church is different, and it's the planning phase. Interestingly, we did some research across the Canadian church. NCD churches in Canada a few years back, but they found the planning phase the most complicated, tying it to the barriers and tying it back to the evidence. I remember, and the same church I'm thinking of as I'm telling you that story about not being able to stick to the plan. They actually weren't that good at sticking to the data. I remember walking into them and saying, you know, how are you doing working on your barrier? And they'd gone right back to a perception instead of dealing with what the survey had resulted in. And so they weren't dealing with something that was actually evidenced. It was something that they had been thinking about before they even did the survey. And it was like, hang on, what did the survey say? What did you figure out during the understand phase, and so on? So all of the phases can be tricky depending on the capacity of the church. So we're now going to step into the experience phase. This is the phase where if we've named the barrier well and we've got a good action plan to remove the barrier or add stuff that replaces something, and we execute the plan faithfully, this is where we should start to see God at work. And so this is all about, and on some levels, 2 or 3 things happen here in my mind. One, I think churches tend to be a bit light on blue and that experiential side, probably more so in evangelical churches and I'd say mainline churches. The Pentecostal churches would probably be the churches that would most naturally fit into this sort of, they're not going to talk about structures. They're not going to talk about tests. They're not going to talk about surveys. They're going to talk about what's going on, what's God doing. And so if you don't have a lot of that in your midst, this may feel like a deficit area. That's one. 2, NCD hasn't developed a whole lot of tools for helping churches in this phase. And so I think it's one of the most underdeveloped phases of the cycle that we have. And so I step into all of that with those 2 caveats. So this noticing God at work is tricky stuff for some churches, especially. What difference is it making that we've removed this barrier and tying what God's doing to what we've done? And so it's not like saying, well, God can only do what we can do, but we can get in God's way. As we remove the barrier or we get out of the way, how does that release God to do what God wants to do, which is multiply stuff and produce growth? And so to some degree, this is sort of guidance during this phase, is what's going on in the head, hearts, and hands of one another, and especially what's going on relationally. So we removed a barrier. How is that changing how Mrs. Smith and Mrs. Jones get along now? Or how is it helping the Whitby family? How are they seem a little more together, or they're all coming to church together now. They didn't used to. Just noticing that those small little things that God does, how people are contributing, maybe how much more confident they are. If you think of the wholeness test and the 3 parts of the Trinitarian balance of wholeness, unshakable confidence is the blue. Are people feeling a little more competent or confident and stepping up? Are people feeling like they want to make a contribution and use their gifts and steward their time, treasure, and talent a little differently than maybe they did before? And whether we're working on a quality characteristic that's in the red area or the blue area or the green area, it may impact people across the whole compass. And how are people relating to one another? So that how do we relate? How do we have purpose and meaning? And how do we have confidence and faithfulness and capacity? And is it as I said before, the minimum factor is the minimum factor typically because it's the least understood part of the church's health. So in a church where holistic small groups is the minimum factor, getting them to be able to even do something about holistic small groups might be a challenge. Well, let's say they do remove the barriers, or they're starting to remove the barriers to why their groups aren't holistic and taking care of the head, hearts, and hands. Even if they start to remove the barriers, they may find it difficult to watch and see God at work in that area. That's why it is their minimum factor. It's not the thing that comes most naturally to them. So I walk into this a church that has loving relationships as a minimum factor. We try to we understand the barrier. We remove the barrier. We plan. We remove. It's still going to be a challenge for this church to notice when God does things around loving relationships, because it is the minimum factor. I'm in an Anglican church. Passionate spirituality is the minimum factor. When God starts doing something different, how is the prayer life of people changing? How are people being able to express how they experience God differently than they used to? How are they? How is the prayer life of individuals and/or groups changing? Watching that and watching for it is not going to be the most natural thing. And so, as I say, we haven't developed a lot of tools for helping churches experience God at work more, or helping coaches helping churches do that. So I hope that some of that has been helpful, though. Some of the pitfalls here, when we're in the experience, people want to be doing stuff, and so the doing might seem like enough. Oh, well, we're executing the plan, and we're experiencing the plan, and it feels good, and we're almost happy that we're executing the plan. That's good. And sometimes it's more about doing for God rather than receiving from God. And then sometimes, as I say, people aren't necessarily going to be really focused on the thing that will contribute to health. I'm thinking of a church where they needed to be working on experience of God and experiencing God in one another. And they really wanted to work on what they were stronger at, which was being self-aware, planning, being good at teams, and again, pulling them to the thing that doesn't come as naturally, can feel unnatural. But it may be the thing that they've got to pay attention to, and pay attention, especially when they're watching for what God's up to. Again, just being in the cycle can sometimes be enough for people. They think, oh, well, we're doing NCD, or we're working on health. Isn't that great? And they may sort of miss the obvious because it isn't so obvious, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And then sometimes in this phase, people can get a little too flexible, especially if you've got a lot of blue people in the room. I don't want to disparage blue people, but they will not be designed to stick to the plan. They will want to sort of go, well, wherever the Spirit's leading us. And obviously the group needs to be open to where the Spirit's leading, but there also should be some give and take there around, well, if we're going to deviate from the plan, have we thought that through together? Or are we just sort of waking up today and saying, I don't like the plan anymore, et cetera. And sometimes the project manager Shane, yes.
It looked like Yinwook had his hand up there.
Oh, okay.
Oh, thank you. Sorry to disturb you. So when we join into NCD program, NCD is more focused on natural growth. But definitely all the analysis and understanding experiences look like a technique of the management. So we are not look down the church management, but I really looking for what is the best church management for my church or for myself. So what is a clear kind of line in between this area of the God's grace of God's area, and also human management? If you have experience, what is the kind of your personal kind of borderline? Can be grace of God. This can be our stewardship, the responsibility as the managing His trust church.
Yeah, I would go back to the principles. The principle is God does the growing, we don't. So we can't make things grow. So church management leadership team can't do the growing. But we are co-workers with Christ, and we are the farmers. We can't expect God to do the farming. I remember one time I was teaching a similar workshop and talking about the blue phase, or talking about the cycle. And I remember a very, very blue person stood up and said, well, why do we need all this structure and tools and surveys and stuff? Shouldn't we just pray more? And I'm like, yeah, pray as much as you can. But it is going to take more than that. God is expecting us to work with him in this work. And so we are co-workers. Our job is to do the gardening. If we expect God to do the gardening, we're going to fall flat, because God isn't going to do what he expects us to do. But he also expects us not to do what he's doing. So for me, that may sound kind of spiritual as opposed to technical. And how do you make that work? But this idea that God has a role and we have a role. And I sometimes say to churches, give yourselves a hand that things are so good. And they'll think, oh, well, God did all that. We didn't do it. No, we have done things. The church I live in is a good church because we've done some of that work. God has also been doing the work and doing the work through us. But there is, if people want to treat it as if it's all spiritual and not human, I'd say that's out of balance. And if they want to treat it like it's all human and they don't need God to be on side with them, I'd say that's out of balance. And so the both end of God and us working together has to be at the heart of this. I hope that answers your question on some level.
It's perfect.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Great. Okay. Thanks. And not every church is going to believe that or step into it easily. I recognize that. The very human churches are going to not want to have God helping them much, and the very spiritual, overly spiritualized churches are going to think, this isn't anything to do with us. But anyway, so getting this phase right, people need to be freed up from doing and able to see and receive. And so the Marthas may not find this the easy phase, but the Marys might. And the people who most naturally talk about church, maybe relationally or experientially, they're not talking about bums and seats or nickels and pennies in the plate or numerical stuff. They're more likely to be talking about where they see God at work. They're the people we want at the forefront. And in some churches, those are the people who maybe don't get much airtime because they're not technocratic or they're not planners or they're not thinkers. But if we can seek those people out and free them up and maybe help some of the green people and some of the red people to be more seers and receivers, that's great. But as I say, not a lot of tools to help us get to this. It's more style and posture, I think, at this point. If any of you have tools or mechanisms or processes that would help with this, we'd always be happy to include them into our toolkit. And I think, as I say, I think this is sort of an underdeveloped area in the church globally, but also in NCD, this blue experiential phase of the cycle. And then taking the time and creating the space and posture for waiting, watching, seeing. Sometimes that is and while you may have been doing some doing and you may continue to do in this phase, and so the do phase hasn't stopped necessarily while the experience phase starts. The two can overlap quite significantly. But now that we've got the doing starting, we should start watching, waiting, and seeing. And that sort of contemplative, just waiting on God, waiting to see what he's doing, can be really foreign for churches, especially if they're super busy churches. And so it may feel quite unnatural to do this blue stuff in very red or very green churches. We're going to send you into another little breakout. In your experience, Shane, are you going to put these questions into the chat?
I will. Yep.
Thanks. What impedes a church's capacity for seeing God at work? So I've sort of hinted at some of those things, but maybe talk about those amongst yourselves. And what might you do as a leader in a church or a coach with a church to help people to be able to see God at work in their own lives, in the life of the church, or in your own ministry? You can be talking about this, seeing God at work, watching for God. And some of you might be really good at that, and others of you might be thinking, God, I don't even know what he's talking about. Or how would I help a church with that? And so the third question is really the second question is, what can you do in your own life to be watching for God at work? And the third question is kind of and how can you help other churches? Are there any questions before we go out to the breakout groups? Okay, seeing none, Shane, I think you can release us.
There we go.
Who's talking on behalf of Sue, Ruben, Jane, and Darren?
I'll do it, seeing as I've not done it.
Thank you, Jane.
I think we've decided we're all a bit blue, and we struggle with being a bit confined by the system. That becomes, if we're not careful, that could be the focus rather than Jesus and God and growing the church. But I think Ruben had a really good suggestion about the prayer of examine. It's a really good way of engaging with where God's been at work, and if we get into that routine of using that, and I think he was suggesting that that'd be something you would encourage in the church, that would really, really help you just see where God's at work. And then also having some sort of spiritual friend or advisor or whatever, somebody who you share with who often is more able to see where God's at work than we are. Would that be fair, folks? A summary.
Thank you. Cool. Maybe we should invite you into a blue development meeting. Tools for blue. Although blue people don't really like tools all that much typically. So as you say, they can feel confining and sort of labely and boxy. Matthew, Joe, and Moses, what did you guys talk about?
We found ourselves reflecting on the way that attention often goes to either new technology or new building renovations or a charismatic speaker or something. And everything going on around us, all the shiny new things going on, and that's how we forget to see God working. And we miss the little things, so we need to slow down and stop. And I liked the suggestion of the examined. We were talking more about taking time for silence and reading, and maybe I suggested going for a walk in the woods, but I know not everybody will do that. But just having time to stop and turn off your phone and computer and let your brain reset and let God do something. And to turn that into an example for the rest of your community, because you can't make anybody do that. But if you present that and show that you are doing it and that it helps you see God move, other people will want that, and they need a rhythm that they can follow.
Cool. Thank you. And group one, Steve, Doug, and Allison.
I could go unless somebody else wants to jump in. The things that impede capacity for seeing God at work, one person said ego can get in the way. Another, just lack of expectation. Just having blinders, we just not noticing things outside the box. I said for mine, being American, big always means better. Big means growth and health, and seeing God in the little things, and in the small growth. And then I think, as Allison said, one of the things we could do to help churches is just take some time for people to share with one another where they see God working in the group. And I think we might take plans at looking at the obstacles, looking at the problems, trying to plan to overcome them, but just to take a step back and see where is God at work.
Thanks. I'm going to add one thing to that list. Maybe I mentioned it already, but the bluer people who are kind of good at this and maybe don't get much airtime, giving them more airtime and trying to normalize what they, I'm thinking of some people in a church I was working with where the bluer people weren't listened to much, but the more they got listened to, the more normal they seemed. They didn't seem like the oddballs anymore. And I'm not saying blue people are oddballs. I'm just saying in this church, they were perceived as such. Jane, I just don't want you to be. I notice you have a blue and white shirt on, Jane. Okay, let's keep going. Thank you for all of that. So continuing on in the cycle, the perceived phase, again, not an area that we've got a lot of tools and or equip stuff for coaches and or churches. Both of these phases, the experience and the perceive, are a lot of blue. And I think this is reflective of the fact that I'm not very blue. And Christian and Adam are not very blue. They're very green-red. And so I sometimes, as I say, I think the canon behind NCD is a little light in blue. And so the perceived phase is also blue. And when you're looking at this at the individual use of the cycle, it's called the vision phase. And so the seeing, and I think the experience and perceive phase, they're all about seeing what's going on in one another, see what's happening, see what God's doing. And so for me, maybe because I'm not that blue by nature, I'm working on it. The perceived phase and the experience phase seem a bit similar to me. But as I unpack it, I'm realizing the experience is letting it happen and receiving the breathing in. The perceiving is, and what's that feel like, or what's that look like? And so this phase sort of happens at the end of the experience phase to some degree. We perceive that this is what's happening now, and maybe we perceive what the barriers are now as we get ready to retest and resurvey. And so this is talking about continuing on. So we retest our perceptions. So we kind of thought our perception was A, B, and C before. We removed some barriers. Have our perceptions of what the church looks like changed as a result of going around the cycle? And so we take another look. And as we've been saying, green people, red people, and blue people may feel more attracted to different parts of the cycle as it's unfolding. So this is a long-term continuous process. We used to spend a lot of time talking about how long-term it was, and then we realized we were making it sound like you couldn't do anything quick. And then we spent a lot of time for a few years talking about all the quick wins you could do and the small little things. And it's a both and. There's a long-term obedience in the same direction approach to this, but there's also the little steps. And so a journey, to use Shane's metaphor of the car journey, we only go a mile at a time, but we don't cross 100 miles at once. Maybe we do in a plane, but the car journey it's a step at a time. And I think our walk with the Lord is likewise that. It's what do I have enough light to take the next step, but recognizing that it's a journey that's longer. There's more to it than just the next step. So this is a strategic process of continuous improvement. Those who come out of the continuous improvement movement will feel quite comfortable here. This is ongoing. It's a process, and it's a step-by-step thing. It's about making progress, improving health. It's not a journey that we land here and now we're healthy. There, we're done. It's an ongoing thing. It's not a program with guarantees. Health, growth, just like your personal health, you can do all the things you need to do towards becoming healthier, but there's no guarantee that you won't get cancer or diabetes or dementia. But there's an intentionality and a deliberateness that's required, and a consistency and a faithfulness to cyclical growth. It's like ongoing, deliberate, and intentional, stepping into it, and expecting things to happen, but not being bound by our expectations either. I expect A, B, and C to happen because we removed some barriers. But God may do D and E as well, and we need to be prepared for that. NCD is an annual snapshot of health always. So every time you take the test, let's say you do the survey for eight cycles or 12 cycles or 15 cycles, you will always be getting a current snapshot of what is. And so sometimes people will say, "Is this a strategic planning tool?" Yes and no. It's not a strategic planning tool in a sense, but one of the things you need in strategic planning is a current snapshot of what is. And so this is really helpful for that. I say it's not a strategic planning tool in that this is typically sort of a 1-year horizon, whereas a strategic plan may be 3, 5, 10 years. And so I wouldn't build my strategic plan, or I wouldn't call a pastor based on this year's results. Yes, if we're working on passionate spirituality, we might want a new priest or pastor who has some experience in that and helping churches grow in that area. But that may not be our minimum factor a year or two from now. So this is a bit more short term, even though it's long term. It's the both end of that. And then ultimately, what's interesting about NCD is as you start adding more and more surveys into your profile, you're now starting to get some longitudinal data, and you can start to see trends. And so I can not only step into this church and say, here's where you are, but I can see this is where you've been coming from, and here's the progress you've been making, or the change that's been happening, or the cultural shifts that have been going on. And the church should be able to see that as well. Eventually, and this is where we sort of get to in the next slide, this can almost become predictive as well. So not all of you have done more than one survey, but this is a church that's done three surveys. So the the light blue dots were their first profile, the dark purple dots are their second profile, and the green bars are their current profile. And so you can see the questions in the bottom 10 that are sticky. And so, for instance, question 28, our pastors have too much work to do. It's gone up each time, but it's still relatively low. And question 35, the atmosphere of our church is strongly influenced by praise and compliments. This is going to be a church that says, well, we don't need to encourage one another. They should be doing whatever they're doing as unto the Lord. You can hear in my voice that I sometimes get cranky with these churches, because how will people know what the Lord's happy with if you don't communicate that to them and encourage one another? And so that might be really foreign to some churches. They shouldn't need praise and compliments. And I would say what we know from the data, you don't have to praise and compliment one another, but we know that in healthy growing churches that actually distinguishes churches that are in decline. So as I suppose one of the things I'd like to say about all of these questions, none of them are prescriptive. You don't have to work on people enjoying sermons. You don't have to work on what else is here? That you don't have to work on people being able to talk about their personal problems, either in the church or more closely in small group. But we know that in healthy churches they can and do. And so while they're not prescriptive, there's no reason to not do them. So these questions that stick around, the more dots there are, the more people aren't working on their minimum questions. And they maybe aren't willing to work on their barriers, or they're not naming their barriers accurately, or they're not putting a plan in place that will remove the barriers they have identified, or they're not executing their plan. There's some part of the cycle that they might be missing or not very good at, but for some reason, they are not dealing. So again, when the church does their fourth survey, and these questions are still hanging around, a whole bunch of things can start to happen. So every survey is a really good snapshot of what is current state of health. Multiple surveys starts to show trends. It can also start to become predictive. And that's a pretty bold statement about the power of the In-City Church Survey, but it is all three of those things: present, past, and future. If a church will not work on its minimum factors, and this is the evidence that they aren't, or are, if there aren't many purple dots, then a couple of things start to happen. We call it the gravity of the minimum factor. When a church won't work on its minimum factor, or starts to become quite consistent about its inability to deal with its minimum factor, it will start to drag down their health even more than it already is. And partially that's because people's expectations may have been raised. Oh, we were trying to work on that and nothing's changing. Or the things that we have worked on other than the minimum factor have gone up, but this isn't. And the minimum factor will actually start to pull the church down more if it's not dealt with. So spoiler alert for churches that won't deal with stuff, it'll come back to bite them. And what we find often in churches is they'll pull out around survey 4. We call it the fourth survey slump, because the low hanging fruit may have been picked. The easy barriers have been identified and dealt with. Now we're actually maybe getting close to some of the trickier stuff, and that's really going to impact health of this community. And that's where sometimes churches will go, oh, it's too complicated. We've moved on to something else. We don't like this, etc. Or they just drift away. And so as a coach, it's something to watch for as churches get to third and fourth survey. This sort of, are we dealing with our stuff? And I would say the right time to start dealing with that is in survey 2. If any of the bottom 10 questions show up, we need to be thinking about, well, why are they there, etc. Communication, we talked about trends over time. That's why I just went through that slide quickly. Communication, we've talked about this before, about how important it is through the whole cycle. Keep talking to people. Sometimes just communicating about where we are in progressing through the cycle is enough to keep people happy and engaged and connected. If there's no communication from one year to the next about the survey and the process, people will fill in the blanks. or they'll disengage or disconnect or not, or think health isn't happy, or health isn't happy, health isn't important. So as I say, keep the congregation abreast of progress against the process. You don't have to necessarily be going into a lot of detail about what's happening with everybody or who's experienced some change in their life. You may not need to get into that kind of detail, although some testimony may be great. But this idea of just keeping people abreast, it also keeps health in the forefront. And in our experience over the last 30 years, is if health becomes a once a year thing, it's far less likely to be changed than if it's an ongoing, continuous discussion. We're constantly talking about that barrier, or we're constantly talking about the things we're doing to remove it. In our church, we don't experience God very deeply. What are we doing all year long on that, in our small groups, in our choirs, in our bands, in our et cetera? And then keep that conversation going. As I say, just keep trying to keep health on the front burner. And it's one of the reasons we recommend a health team as separate from the leadership team, so that group can be responsible for some of that. What's next in the cycle and for you? What's next for you? We were going to talk a little about some of the other things that Fort Elm NCD has. We're going to be creating a practitioner circle. So we're going to be inviting you to join that practitioner circle and with other coaches, just where we can talk about what's working in your church, what's working in the churches you're working with, what are you bumping up against, anywhere around the cycle, all that sort of stuff. We've talked a little bit about the Empowering Leadership course. We have in conjunction, in partnership with NCD Norway, we've done the Empowering Leadership course, and we're looking with them to put all 8 of the quality characteristics on the same learning platform, and it's a sort of online classroom setting in a small group, and then each person gets one-on-one coaching around their profile. And then we're thinking of creating some new workshops, specific ones around different parts of the cycle, like barrier identification, like action planning, like experience, where we'd go into more depth and be able to talk one another together. So I'm sorry we haven't got much time for checkout. So I'm going to ask you in a word or phrase, what's been the most important element of the training for you? And I'm going to ask you at the same time, I'm not going to ask you the question, and that's a subsequent question that you can answer on your own. You don't have to answer that in the checkout. Have you completed the feedback survey from SurveyMonkey that was sent out yesterday? So relatively quickly, if we can, and I'm just going to pick you. As I name someone, I'll name who's going to come after. That'll just speed up the order a little bit. What's been a main thing in a word or phrase, not a long sentence because we don't have any time now, that's been really, really fundamental for you? And you always have the right to pass or say, come back to us. So I'm going to start with you, Allison, because you're at the top of my sheet or my screen. And Doug, I'm going to have you go after.
Can you come back to me, please?
Absolutely. Doug, are you ready to go? And
Yeah, I'd say just understanding, going deeper, understanding the barriers.
Okay. And that was going to be Steve Fripp. So Steve Masson, you'll be next. Steve Fripp.
Blue is good.
Okay. Steve?
I really appreciated the Shane's presentation of the grid, the pruning grid. I see that as just a very useful. Now, I tend to think that way, but I think it really can help be an image you can set there and then have lots of conversation and get feedback on with just that matrix.
That's your word or phrase.
Oh, prune.
Prune. Jane, then Matthew.
I think for me it's phrase. It's a vocabulary we can share in our diocese with our churches that help us communicate.
Matthew, then Darren.
Never stop communicating.
Darren, then Moses.
Come back to me.
Okay.
For me to
Moses,
have
then Ruben.
to have eyes to see, eyes of the prophetic view and pastoral view, also as a farmer to see the ground and people.
Ruben, then Ricardo.
Journey system and blue.
Ricardo, then Sue.
Working together, if we put our heads together, we can really, really work with the Spirit of God to grow the church.
Sue, then Allison.
I think the challenge of finding ways for blues to work the process.
It's like we're picking on blues. Allison, then Darren, you're going to get the last word. Well, I guess Shane and I'll have the last word. Allison?
I raised awareness of who we are as God's people.
Darren?
Sorry, I'm frozen.
Oh, there we are.
I'm back. I think people more than process.
Shane?
All your questions.
And one of the things that I'm taking, just in this checkout alone, I'm just amazed at the diversity that you represent and what you took and what you heard and what you're thinking and feeling and so on and so on. So I'm really struck by the diversity of God's people and what that means. And I'm also, I'm really inspired about what we might be able to do to support the blue part of this process. So stay tuned. Thank you very much for your engagement and participation. It's been a real delight to work with you. And we'll look forward to seeing you again at our practitioner circles in the coming months. Let me pray for you as you go. Heavenly Father, thank you for your blessing. This has been, looking at the screen is like looking into your face. And so that's powerful stuff. And we just thank you for one another. We thank you that we know you, that you know us. And together we can see you revealed more and more in our individual lives and in the lives of the churches. We thank you for the hope that that brings in a world that is often kind of hopeless and stupid. We want to be you. We want to be the light that you are. We want to bring life to in all its fullness to as many people as possible. And so we just want to experience heaven on earth and knowing that you are coming back to get us someday. And so we just praise you and thank you for all of that mystery that's unfolding even as we speak. Amen.